So I see your Wraith Knight happens to be lying down. I guess that'll help it get a better cover save. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the thorny topic of modelling for advantage, exactly what it is, some common examples of it, and why it isn't really a very clever idea to do if you're trying to play a competitive game of 40k. Put simply, modelling for advantage is assembling the model in an abnormal way, generally so the size or profile of the model can give you an advantage in-game. And typically this is seen as not really playing fair if you're trying to play any sort of competitive game of Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop typically balances their rules around models having certain base sizes and a certain height profile. For example, things like Imperial Knights should be fairly easy to hit on the battlefield, and they should be pretty hard to hide, so you could gain a significant advantage if you modelled it in such a way that it had a much smaller profile that you could easily hide behind line of sight blocking terrain. Modelling for advantage is certainly a spectrum. It can range from the very minor mounting your model on a bigger scenic base because it looks nicer, or assembling a model with its sword held downwards rather than lifted up into the air, to far more major and obviously silly things like modelling your Wraith Knight lying down on the floor so it can easily take cover, for example, which is an example I have seen in person. In my opinion, there really isn't much scope for this sort of overt modelling for advantage in Warhammer 40k. If you're playing in a competitive event, then typically tournament organisers will rule against it and tell you to assume that the line of sight is where it should be and the base is the size it should be, or potentially just remove models from play when they're obviously trying to take the mickey. In more casual games, it's obviously a little bit less serious and the rules are a bit more relaxed, so if you're gaining minor advantages from cool conversions and things, most players won't be too bothered about that, but if you are doing some of those obviously silly conversions or poses and things, you kind of have to ask yourself why you're trying to gain so much advantage in a game which doesn't really matter and is supposed to be fun for both players. All that being said, let's talk about some of the ways that players might either intentionally or unintentionally model for advantage. Firstly, using the wrong base for the model can be quite a big advantage or disadvantage. Particularly for characters and things, smaller bases can help with positioning and hiding. So if you've got an enormous demon prince running around on a very tiny base, it might make it easier for him to get in enemy formations or hide in ruins and things. And using smaller bases than the models come with can also help massed infantry formations, things like chaos demons or orcs. Using the smaller style bases will give you an advantage over the bigger style bases for the most part, because it means that you can fill more bodies in one part of the board and create more concentration of force. On the other hand, for certain characters, large bases can also be a problem. A lot of characters in Warhammer 40k have powerful aura abilities, and if you intentionally model, say, a Space Marine captain on a much larger base than it's supposed to have, then that could seriously increase the radius of his aura abilities by quite a lot. So this can potentially be a way that you're not playing fair if you have mounted your character on a big scenic base, which a lot of people like to do just because it looks cool without thinking about the rules implications. If you do this, I'd probably have a mind as to what the actual size of the model's base actually should be, and measure the aura abilities from there rather than the edge of whichever scenic base you might have given to your nicely painted commander. Games Workshop is interesting on this in that they do have a base size guide for Age of Sigmar, but they don't for 40k. Their current policy is just to use whichever base the model was sold with, which seems reasonable enough for me, but it does create some issues with some kits that have had their base size updated. Things like Orc Boys, notably, for example, have had their base size updated from 25mm to 32mm when Games Workshop last refreshed the kit, but they didn't actually change the models at all. Now in competitive tournament play, particularly things like the ITC, they generally rule that they have to be on the newest size bases that Games Workshop is selling them with. So that'll mean that Orc Boys are only allowed to be fielded in some tournaments with their 32mm bases, despite some Orc players, myself included, having well over 100 Orc Boys that are based on the 25mm bases that they were sold with, and it would be a massive effort to update them to another size base just because Games Workshop has arbitrarily updated the kit. In general, in more casual games, I think it's pretty acceptable to be playing with the older bases, as Games Workshop hasn't made any rules to say that you can't. For competitive tournament events though, you probably should be updating to the bigger bases, which is something I'll probably have to get round to at some point. But I'll be honest, it is still pretty annoying, as they haven't even updated the models at all, just the base size. Leaving base size grumblings aside, the other most common way of modelling for advantage is doing strange assemblies that help either increase or decrease the height or width of your models. With true line of sight the way it is in 40k, if any part of your model can see any part of an opponent's model, even if that's something as silly as an antenna or a flag on the top of it, then they are allowed to shoot them with full effect. In general, I am a fan of this fairly simplified line of sight rule, but it does make some silly scenarios, where you could literally only see a tank because of the antenna that's poking over the top of a hill. So one way that people can model for advantage is to just not assemble the model with antennas or optional flags on the top of it. In all honesty, I don't really have too much of a problem with this, provided it's not a major intrinsic part of the model. And honestly, some of their kits, they do sell antennas and things that really easily snap off the top, just when you're trying to transport the things, even if you wanted to include them on. It just gets a little bit silly when you're leaving a bit that obviously should be on the top of the model off, and it's clear that you're doing this to reduce the amount of line of sight to that model. One example that I've seen myself is a Deathwatch Watchmaster that just conveniently had the top of his power sword that he holds aloft snapped off, which gave the model a much lower profile, and I honestly think that it probably was to get a lower profile on the model to allow him to hide out of line of sight when needed. I think that this one only really becomes an issue when you're missing a part that the model obviously wouldn't be doing without in any normal circumstances. Another very controversial topic is the option of leaving off flying bases, which we can see as an example on this suppressor in the top right hand corner. Now again, this drastically reduces how high the model is. This can be really quite a big advantage as you're losing quite a bit of height off the top of the model, meaning that you will have the opportunity to hide them a bit better if you really want to. The thing is, with flying bases, it's usually quite intuitive as to whether or not they need to be on. Things like Eldar jet bikes and things will look a bit silly glued to the base of the model, but with things like the suppressors that seem to have the normal format for building them with the flying bases on, but they quite clearly have legs and can walk, so it's certainly not unreasonable to think that they could be models standing on the base. And in all honesty, I think they look quite good doing so. Personally, if I was running them this way, I would be happy to say to my opponent that if it makes a difference from line of sight targeting, count them as being X centimeters taller than they currently are, so you can gain line of sight to them if that makes a difference. This would save any bad feeling created later in the game, if they think they might be being a bit gamey and modelling for advantage that way. Though I do accept that there isn't any enforced rule that they have to have those flying bases on, other than how the instructions advise you to build the model, so it is hard to argue it's a hard and fast game rule, so I can see both sides of the debate. A bit more obvious in terms of models that are clearly trying to gain line of sight advantage are things that are lying down or crouching who otherwise typically wouldn't be. Things like that Wraith Knight that we mentioned, but also maybe just basic troops that would usually be standing on 2 feet, lying down on their bases, or anything like that. Again, I've absolutely got nothing against it if it's a cool conversion project, and you wanted to have a squad of your Tau Fire Warriors going prone or something. But again, I would advise to say to your opponent that if you want to count them as this high for the terms of you targeting them, then that's absolutely fine. In a much more grey area of modelling for advantage is exactly how your models are holding their swords or lances and things, which again can be a big difference as to whether or not you gain line of sight on them. One example that I've noted are the Custodes bikers with their enormous power lances. Some of them are held up vertically, and some are held down going in for the attack if you build them from the base kit. Now the ones that are held up vertically are generally going to be at a big disadvantage in terms of ever trying to hide them, because pretty much everything's going to be able to shoot them if they're trying to point that up above the cover that they're trying to hide in. For this particular example, I wouldn't really care too much how those lances are held, particularly as there's no reason that the entire squad wouldn't be going in for the attack. It looks perfectly natural for them to be doing so. I think that for the most part, most people will be happy to have the arms modelled in any way that looks sort of natural. Although it does seem to be a bit more gamey if it is a monopose model that you've actively converted to have a sword or outstretched hand held downwards. I'm thinking of things like that Deathwatch Watchmaster again. He's very much a monopose kit who usually has that spear held very high. I've got nothing to say that he couldn't be holding it in a bit more of a lower position, but the model gives you absolutely no scope to do that without some significant work. It's most definitely a grey area. Finally, in terms of getting lower profile and width, as Games Workshop does tend to update its kits every so often, you do get kits that have models that are going back to the 90s and things, that's no longer in production, are typically massively smaller than their current incarnation. Folks like Marnius Calgar have a much tinier model than they have now, or the older versions of the Eldar Wraith Lords. Again, generally being smaller for big heavy hitters is generally an advantage, as it means that you can hide them safe from your opponent. One solution I've seen to this issue is people often tending to mount these models on a bigger base, the one that the actual model that is currently sold comes with, and maybe adding a bit of scenery or things to make sure that they're the same height. As we've discussed, base size and height and width tend to be the biggest areas of contention, so provided your opponent's happy that they have the same profile as the normal model, or in a more casual game are just absolutely happy to play with the model as is, then it can head off a lot of bad feeling. There are a few other slight issues, such as movable parts on models, such as sponsons or turrets. I'm not entirely clear as to the wording of this on whether or not they can be moved in-game. Games Workshop's movement phase rules seem to be that no point on the model can be further in move distance to where that point on the model started, so you couldn't say move your model a maximum move distance and then swing out these sponsons or turrets to try and get a little bit of further distance and maybe get another line of sight. But possibly rules as written, you might be able to turn a turret and count it as having moved in the movement phase and maybe acquire a new line of sight that way. In any case though, I wouldn't do this myself. The vast majority of models don't have moving parts, and it generally isn't expected to be part of the game, though your models might be changing shape as the game goes through. So when I'm fielding my Lehman Russes and things, I typically just tend to leave them in the configurations that they've been set up in, and just move the whole model from place to place. Another random thing that I've heard of is people using enormous overhanging parts of the model to physically block movement for enemies trying to charge it, and claiming that you can't move through the parts of the model that are there, because they've spread out some massive wings to physically block any models getting within 1 inch of them. Now this is definitely modelling for advantage, no one's going to be impressed by this sort of shenanigans, so I wouldn't personally do this if you want to remain any sort of friends with the person that you're playing against, and in competitive games, tournament organisers will not be on your side. So those are the major examples of modelling for advantage that I can think of. It is worth noting that a lot of times when people are doing fun conversions and things, they actually wind up modelling for disadvantage, maybe adding on a whole load of extra bits and fun pieces that only allow your tank to be targeted better. And also when you are gaining or reducing the profile of a model, it does sometimes work out two ways. Say for example those suppressors, they have a lower profile, which I would say is generally an advantage, but it might impact the line of sights that they themselves can get, so there is a bit of a trade-off, but I'd still say that it's a net gain from making them lower profile. My general advice is that provided you're clear about the height and the dimensions of the models as they should be, and ideally have some way to mark that, then the vast majority of people will be absolutely fine playing against models that are assembled slightly abnormally, provided you're clear that you're not trying to gain an in-game advantage from any way that you've put together your model. Now I know that this is a fairly controversial topic, so I'd be interested to hear your opinions on it, and if you've seen any particularly stupid examples of modelling for advantage, I'd also love to hear them. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have 40k content coming out pretty much every day, including plenty of tactics things and other discussion videos like this. If you'd like to support the channel and you live in the UK, I do have an Element Games affiliate link down in the description below. Basically, if you're looking to buy some Warhammer in the near future, and you are planning to order it in through one of the third-party discount retailers like Element is, then if you give that link a click before ordering, then some of the profits goes to Auspex Tactics to help out the channel without costing you any more at all. I've never had any trouble with Element orders, and they've always had good customer service for me, so I'm happy to recommend them. And obviously only buy something if you're thinking about buying something already. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.